Grant, who I get so many, it's a good thing I like him, otherwise I'd get bored hearing people every speech I go, do you know Bob Grant? What's he really like? Hey, that guy's great.
I think what I'm going to have to do is make sure that I listen to you every day coming in, because you get my adrenaline flowing. And I must say, it's good to have you on here in the daytime and have your broadcast come on a little before we go on the air at 4 o'clock. By the way, thank you for filling in last week. Because
I've got some observations about the hostilities in Lebanon and the accompanying civilian casualties.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I think that the listeners should be aware of the fact that the PLO bases are inevitably smack in the middle of their own civilian centers. Now, they've learned through bitter experience that if they're going to be hit, the civilians are going to be hurt too if they follow that pattern. I mean, if they're real men, if their goal is to attack Israelis, they should get out of those civilian centers and fight them one-on-one, military against military. Apparently, their political aims are much more important to them than their own women and children. That's number one. Number two, look at the way the Israelis captured the terrorist towns of Sidon and Tyre. They first dropped leaflets. Thousands were saved because they listened to those leaflets and they packed the beaches. They didn't stay in the towns. Now, let's compare that to the way an Arab army takes an Arab town. Remember Hama in Syria a few months ago?
Yes.
They, the Syrians, that is, flattened that town because they opposed Assad's regime. 10,000, 20,000, we don't know how many thousands were killed there because of the Syrian censorship. And how did they destroy that town? Well, they didn't go house to house looking for the culprits, as the Israelis do, and that's why the Israelis, by the way, are suffering grievous casualties. Mm-hmm. They just took their artillery about a mile outside the town and lobbed shells until it was flattened.
Right, right. Those Russians could come to Virginia and tutor anytime they want weekend work. Gromyko stands up in the United Nations and says Russia assumes, the Soviet Union now, assumes the obligation, what beautiful lyric, assumes the obligation of not being the first to use nuclear weapons. And what beautiful timing right after the rally, a few days after the big Central Park rally. And the world goes crazy. The delegates stomp, they cheer. The third world delegates line up to congratulate Gromyko. They're all so excited. Looked like they were about to get naked and throw ice cubes at each other out of the sheer frenzy of Russia's magnificent, magnanimous gesture. They're not going to be the first to use nuclear arms. Now, how long does it take you to see through this consumer fraud? I must admit it was not instantaneous with me. It took me 45 minutes or maybe an hour. I discount the time I was doing commercials because my mind wasn't thinking about world politics. It took me, let's figure it took me 1 calendar hour to see through that transparency. And now the network television commentators say the world will now watch to see if President Reagan can top or even match Brezhnev's offer. Well, I think the president could probably match it with one eyebrow if he chooses to. The way I would match it is simply to tell the Russians, nice try. I mean, you can't blame a con man for trying to sell you a 5-way can opener as you enter Grand Central Station. That's his job. That's his mission. Of course, they're going to stand up and try to garner and gather all the points and all the acclaim. They're going to try to get as many Americans turning on people like me and saying, no matter what the Russians do, you don't seem to like it. I mean, you're so endemically and hysterically and witch-huntingly anti-communist. Whatever they do, you don't like it. And just because it's Russian, just because it's Soviet, just because it's Moscow, just because it's communist, you don't like it. No, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't like this because it's fraudulent. You see, Russia dominates the world in conventional means of waging war. If they pin us down to a pledge, even if the pledge is not totally enforceable, it still indicates a nation's instinct and its drift and its proclivity. It would certainly handicap our first use of nuclear weapons. And then where are we? We are in a world where the Soviet Union is the most powerful military power. You see, if Soviet tanks roll into Western Europe, Russia still lives up to its pledge. It is not going to be the first to use nuclear arms. If we then use limited nuclear weapons to try to stop their attack, oh, then we're the bad guys, aren't we? We have been the first to use nuclear weapons. I hope the president simply slams the ball right back to the Russian side of the court. And after that caller yesterday, I'm never going to say Russian again carelessly or capriciously. It is Soviet. I keep forgetting the Russians are one of, admittedly the dominant, but they are one of 180 people imprisoned in something called the Soviet Union. Let's call it the Soviet ploy. I want it slammed right back to the Soviet side of the court with this proposal. Nice try, Soviet Union. But how about agreeing to the real thing? For our part, until we have real disarmament with real on-site inspection, teams of you crawling all over here, teams of us happy, free to go wherever they want to inside the Soviet Union, real, verifiable, on-site inspection until you're ready for the real thing. Then don't try to buffalo us by saying you won't be the first to use nuclear weapons. That's very big of you since you dominate the world in non-nuclear weapons. We, America, will pledge, we will assume the obligation of not using nuclear arms unless attacked. Unless America or a NATO ally is attacked, we will not use the nuclear weapon. Because it is a very interesting thing you bring up. Why are people like me always praising Israel, always praising America, and rarely criticizing Israel, rarely criticizing America, always criticizing the Soviet Union, always criticizing the PLO? I can understand where you sit there and you listen, and that violates your sense of fairness. You say, by golly, why doesn't he ever talk about what Israel does is wrong, what America does is wrong? You mean the PLO's all that bad? You mean the Soviet Union's all that bad? Ma'am, if I had to give a short answer, the answer would be yes. That's exactly what I mean. Once upon a time, and I'm glad I was born in that era because it's lost now, and I want to go down still believing what I believed as a young man, and that is that it is no virtue to be even-handed. There's a newspaper in New York City. It is utterly even-handed as between dictatorship and democracy. Utterly even-handed between those who vow to exterminate Israel and Israel, which is determined to survive. America is a democracy, ma'am. Israel is a democracy. Forgive me for preaching my democratic religion to you. I feel it almost like a religion because look at the results. I feel my Jewish religion on faith. I don't need faith to feel my democratic religion. Look around at the world. Look at the democracies and what they've achieved in standards of living and freedom of expression and to make something out of your life. And look at the dictatorships of the world. They're jails, ma'am. I'm glad you're living in a democracy. Israel is a democracy. America is a democracy. Democracies make mistakes. But a dictatorship, a land that tells others what to do, is making one unending, constant mistake.
I've been listening to you for quite a few years, and this is only the second time I've ever called you. Would beg your indulgence to hear me out, and I'd like your comment on something that I'm about to say. I feel that you have been wrong in three of the most important events in American history. The first one was dealing with the assassination of President Kennedy. You had often said that the people must believe the government, that there was no conspiracy, and that was untrue. There was a conspiracy.
Sir, how far back are you going? I mean, if I quit believing in the Warren Commission late in life, I guess around 1970. But I mean, are we really going into business that old? I thought you were talking about nuclear freeze or ERA or something. Yeah, okay.
The second point that I think you were wrong in is about the anti-Vietnam War protesters. You took exception to them on many occasions, and they proved to be right that that war was illegal and immoral, and the people, because of the people's protesting, that war was stopped. Third point is the anti-nuclear rally on Saturday when you made comments referring to the fact that, to your opinion, that Brezhnev is pleased, and why don't they try to get Brezhnev and the Russians to agree to the same thing? You know, the voice of the people, I have a lot of respect for the voice of the majority of the American people because instinctively they know it's right, and I can't understand why you always take this right-wing approach to all of these major questions in our society.
All right, sir, a very legitimate complaint. First of all, let me therapeuticize you a little bit. Don't get mathematical and say, Barry, you have been wrong on 3 of the most important things. I think the simple explanation is you and I just disagree. I think you and I disagree on 300 different things or 3,000 different things, many of them important, some of them achieving importance overnight. I mean, the Falkland Islands were not important 4 months ago. Now, as for the rally being the voice of the people, it's a big rally, 700,000 people, let's say. I'm giving them the outside figure because I'm not going to do a body count. I'm just grateful all those bodies are living. 700,000 people, let's say. And now you right away, the next week, talk about the voice of the people. The voice of the people have spoken. Sir, Fidel Castro is the only one who can get away with that in his country. 1 million people get out into Plaza Civica in Havana. Oh, viva Fidel. That's the voice of the people. You see, rallies are nice, but elections, particularly free elections like we have, are a little more to the point.
The people have seen what he and his staff represent. They are warmongers, and they are not for the...
All right, so I'm cutting you off now merely on the unlikelihood that you're going to say anything new. When you get down to insane and warmonger, I think I understand the drift of what you really have to say. Now, may I make any...
The president has said yesterday that he would never be the first to start a nuclear war.
And I propose that we say in response, we will not use the nuclear bomb unless attacked. Okay, my statement makes sense. His is fraudulent. We have a legitimate security. It is Soviet repression of its captive peoples, Soviet aggression against peoples it does not yet hold captive, and the overall Soviet threat. I think you're committing something very American, and I hope you keep on committing it. You are forcing yourself to look at the other guy's cards, to take the other guy's point of view. You're using that old American, it's older than the first white man on this continent. An old Indian proverb said, if you want to know another man, you must walk for one day in his moccasins. Okay?
Right.
I respect you for that marvelous feeling, but after you've exchanged your marvelous feeling and I've exchanged mine, I still worry about the Soviet Union.
I agree.
What to hope for from the young? I see no evidence that there is a liberal clique in the Kremlin. I hear our liberals say, don't put the pressure on Russia, hope that Poland blows over, don't encourage solidarity, help the Russians with their problems in wheat and money in Afghanistan and Poland, because if you make things difficult for the Soviets, it will embolden the Soviet hawks and weaken the Soviet doves. I want to see me a Soviet dove. Before I die, I want to see a confirmed, hog-tied, branded Soviet dove. I want to meet the member of the Politburo who says, why in the hell did we roll over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and Poland, and Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, and East Germany? That's not nice. Let's let those countries go again, like America let the Philippine Islands go again after we had conquered them. I want to meet the Soviet dove who says Afghanistan is a disgrace. Join me in a candlelight vigil to beg the Afghans forgiveness for what we visited upon them there. I want to see the Soviet dove in the Politburo who says, what a disgrace that we have Lech Walesa under house arrest through our Polish stooges. Let us release him immediately and give him a check for $2 million to apologize for what we did to hobble Solidarity's growth. You show me that Soviet dove, you see, and then perhaps you and I can join together at the hip and march.
Well, one of the administrators of the Marshall Plan was a man named John J. McCloy, an attorney. Actually, he's alive and lives here in New York. And John J. McCloy and the committee that developed the Marshall Plan sat down and viewed the security of Europe in terms of who controls energy production. And as you pointed out, before the war, it used indigenous coal. France used indigenous coal, and quite effectively. They'd evolved a manufacturing system that worked around that. Well, after World War II, the United States viewed the security of Europe in terms of things like unions, and the coal unions were socialist controlled. And it was determined that in order to secure the economic independence of Europe, in our terms, we would have to do something to remove the power of the coal unions. And so we put them on oil. And we built them on, rebuilt all of the factories and the machinery to produce in Europe on an oil technology, which is not a naturally occurring technology there. So what happened over the years is that evolved since the oil companies account for 75% of the ownership of uranium fuel in the world today. And that evolved right into, the two are so connected. It's frightening. It's the oil industry.
But are the atomic...
Owned by a company called GPU, General Public Utilities. And they're experiencing tremendous financial burdens as a result of this, to the point that they are no longer a viable economic entity.
I'm drifting here. Hold the line, Dr. Todorovich. Wait. Sure. I have a choice, and my partners for the broadcast, Monique Van Voren, David Schulte, Dr. Moreau Todorovich, professor at City College and executive director of Scientists and Engineers for Secure Energy. Bob Monroe and Corrine Brown are co-authors of Time Bomb, Understanding the Threat of Nuclear Power. Bob, I don't know what I'm going to do with you. I have a choice of coming down upon your arguments and alienating you, or being nice to you and having you come back and back and back and back to argue what I perceive as your point. I have a hard time finding people the president in a recent press conference said knee-jerk. I'd like to find a more elegant phrase. But look at what you've said and gotten away with. You have gotten away with accusing America of putting France on oil after World War II because the French coal miners' union was socialist. I have never heard anything as outrageous muttered in a dulcet voice with a straight face.
Well, I suggest...
Wait a damn minute. Forgive me. Let me finish. Wait a minute.
A little more.
You're accusing America of putting France on oil because, the French coal miners' union was socialist, and that's kind of left, and that's somehow in the direction of communists, and we didn't like that, and therefore we took France off of coal and put France on oil. Sir, this is such arrant nonsense. The Norwegians, the rightmost Norwegian union is far to the left of the leftmost French union. The Norwegians are all what you would call socialist, and yet we did not take Norway off anything and put Norway on anything. Why? How dare you suggest that America, back then in the heady days of the Marshall Plan, perceived leftism in a French union and said, what are they into? They're into coal. That will never do. Let's forget coal and bypass this French socialist union that is leftist and put France on oil where the leftists can't touch it. Sir, that is a wretched, malignant view of history, and my other guests may choose to put up with it because you speak in a calm voice, but I suspect you know better, and I suspect you of deliberate mischief-making, and I think historical mischief-making is one of the worst kinds of mischief, and you've got to prove that to me. I'm not calling you a liar. I'm just telling you what a liar I am if you're telling the truth.
Okay. Well, what I will suggest to you is to read a book, a very important book, by Richard Barnett called The Lean Years, which traces the development of energy patterns in the United States and in the world, and explains very clearly exactly how that phenomenon I just explained took place. And furthermore, I didn't say the American people did this. I didn't accuse America of putting France on.
As Reagan said in the debate with Carter, there you go again. Whoever accused you of accusing the American people? This is the oldest trick in the book.
No,
you don't blame the American people. You blame the Wall Street oligarchy of atomic plunder.
It's a capitalist plot, is what he's saying.
Exactly. Now, if we did that to France, why didn't we do it to the socialist unions of Norway, the socialist unions of Denmark, the socialist unions of Belgium? I think, sir, you are perpetrating something malignant and dire, and I think that you know, look me in the eye, I think you know very well what you are doing. I don't think you are accustomed to being challenged on the air, and I want to challenge you frontally. I think that what you are doing is not writing a book about nuclear energy and the dangers. I think you are using your own personal bigotry, prejudice, hang-up, perception, proclivity, whatever, to change the world your way. That's fair. I want to change the world my way, too. But I don't expect to get away with lies, and I don't expect you to expect to get away with lies on this show. How dare you tell into a microphone in a calm tone of voice that, well, after World War II, the French coal miners were socialists and America didn't like that, and we therefore put the French on oil instead of coal. Stop right there. I don't care about nuclear energy until we clear this thing up.
I would suggest you read the book I just
Excuse me, may I point out that in the Wall Street Journal, which you would say, of course, there was a little article about the Institute of Policy Studies, of which Richard Barnett is one of the founders. Well, when you then pick Richard Barnett to quote here as an authority, it's exactly along the line how in this book you selectively picked only those people who fitted your preconceived title, understanding the threat of nuclear power. You put on front threat and then proceed to wave the story so that it fits the music. At least, and here comes all together with the nuclees and all the other accusations that are on the book of certain people. Goffman, for example, whom you quote here, has come to a position where since no one agrees with him except 3 or 4 people or 5, he quotes that everybody else is in the pay of something and that he is a criminal. But at some point, one has to look in the mirror and decide whether there has left any way of which we can validate certain things in a certain calm manner, check whether the gravity is still 9.8 or not, and then proceed, or do we want to shape the argument so that it just suits our preconceived notion? And you seem to be doing that. I'm only surprised how 2 young people like you and Corinne are spending your obvious capacities of writing well on something that is so patently wrong.
And you know what gets me so damn mad? They could go on every other talk show in America and speak that calmly and have a book that looks as noble and I agree is well written. I'll bet you 999 out of 1,000 American talk show hosts would either yawn or light a cigarette or smile at their girlfriend in the control booth and let you get away with such nonsense as the French coal miners' unions were socialist and the Americans therefore pulled the plug off of coal and put the French on oil. I get so damn mad at my colleagues for wanting to do their show and do their commercials and earn their money. I'm enraged at how many American interviewers that I fantasize would simply let that go down because you've written a book and you're nice and you speak well and you write well and you want to come on and talk stuff like that. I challenge you.
Well,
I think we've gotten really a long way from atomic energy. We now seem to be attacking all the other talk show people.
Ma'am, may I remind you of story 001 in my field. I don't know what your field is. My field is broadcast journalism. And story number 001 goes like this. David Schulte, you're excused because you've heard it before, okay? The cub reporter on his first assignment, don't yawn, David, you hadn't heard it that many times. The cub reporter is assigned to cover his first story, the PTA meeting at the schoolhouse. He comes back crestfallen. And the editor says, where's your story? And he says, there's no story. And the editor says, why not? And the reporter says, because there was no PTA meeting. And the editor says, why not? And the reporter says, because the schoolhouse burned down. Now, don't you come blaming me for getting far away from nuclear energy when your colleague has given the outright communist view
it's all
of
my
recent
fault. It's
history.
my quest to generate.
You're right. It's not the communist view because the communists have too much sense and not enough guts to try to perpetrate a view that extremely left upon the innocent American listenership. No communist would have the gall today to come to a microphone like that and try to tell the American people what you've tried to tell the American people. They have too much sense. They've been spanked too much. They've had their thumbs wrapped too much. They've been burned too much. You have more courage than the communists. No communist would try to tell an intelligent American listenership, which I'm proud to announce is what you're addressing right now, that because the French coal miners' union was socialist, we pulled the plug on coal and put the oil needle in the French vein.
No answer to it. He identified himself at the opening of the show as a bigot, and I love it when people stand by their statements.
Hold it, Wilbur. You're damn right. I am a bigot in favor of truth. And I do not believe you are telling the truth as you, sir, perceive the truth. I don't believe that you believe that America put France on oil because the French coal miners were socialist. We'll be right. They say that nuclear power is dangerous, and what got us into the fight is they said that we turned France away from coal and onto oil because, are you ready? Are you sitting down? Is your seatbelt fastened? Because after World War II, the French Coal Miners Union was socialist, and we weren't going to have any of that. We were going to pull the rug out from under them and take them off of coal and put them on oil. Once you've told me that, you've told me a great deal about your entire underlayer of thought.
What was anything about conventional forces and all that? I think that both countries should be striving for arms control, and I'm sure that covers conventional arms, too.
You mean an agreement?
Yes.
The Soviet Union recently signed the Helsinki Agreement. The Soviet Union is breaking the Helsinki Agreement in Poland, as is the puppet government of Poland. Now, I'm not going to embarrass you by saying, do you agree? Because if you don't agree, you're going to proclaim yourself as non compos mentis. You obviously have to agree. You have to agree 2 + 2 is 4. You have to agree the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. You have to agree that Monique Van Voren was raised in Flemish and in French. And you have to agree that Poland and the Soviet Union are violating the Helsinki Accord.
Of course,
now, if they are doing that, what in the world propels you to come to an American microphone and appeal to the American people to accept some arms agreement with the same government which is raping their last agreement in Poland right this minute?
There's only one word that I can give you. The thing that propels me is fear.
Yeah, but this same argument was used back in World War II, and the Japanese added their and the Germans, World War erupted. World War
have one David Schulte preaching strength, then 100 Koreans begging for peace, because Korean is not going to get peace, and David, in preaching strength and defiance, has a much better chance.
What does strength mean?
Gary,
what do you mean by that?
You're making the most irrational statements because
I am making the only rational
logic of madness.
I am making the only rational
based on a totally
the mask is off. You're no longer pretending to be talking about corroded pipes under Pennsylvania. You're talking about what you're really about, and I welcome talking about that. And when we reconvene, we'll talk about it a little more. They unmask themselves early, and now unmask themselves totally as being part of the same old dodge, peace through disarmament and agreements, and do you have children, and how do you feel about nuclear war? And I am endorsing David Schulte's point. I think it's my point too, but overwhelming American military power is the only way to achieve peace. And how dare you come before us? I mean, have you no shame? Have you no embarrassability? After the Soviet Union has done what it has done before the eyes of the world in Poland, are you still willing to come before us and say, talk, dialogue, détente, disarmament, talks, agreements? How can you have any faith whatsoever in that? 1938 was the last year I could forgive anybody for believing in any of that.
To not make any more nuclear weapons. To stop producing nuclear weapons.
You're an astute man. What Soviet politician is likely to lose the next election because of this insane policy of reckless armament?
I might ask you what likely American citizen is likely to lose his next life if we don't sit down and discuss
any number of them. But if this happens, and with our free press and free election, you can be sure the people, if they experience the revulsion against nuclear energy that you feel, will turn the rascals out.
And that's exactly what's happening.
You know, I think...
Now, I don't stop. Wait. You pulled the gypsy switch, and you can't do it on this broadcast. Well, try the others. I asked you what Soviet politician is going to be thrown out of office by the voters of the Soviet Union for pursuing the policy that you say is harming the Russian population.
But do you think who thinks that the Russians vote?
I don't assume that they have any voting power.
Now we're getting somewhere. The Russians don't vote. Public opinion in the Soviet Union counts for 0.00. Right. Public opinion in America counts for 100.00. 100%. We vote. We vote all the time. We vote every year.
Well, half of us vote
every 2 years
or pro-Soviet.
I didn't say you were anti-American. I said you were anti-common sense, you're anti-logic, you're anti-sanity. Because the Soviet Union, once upon a time, we had a marvelous statistic. It was valid. The Soviets broke 50 out of 52 treaties, and the only 2 they kept were treaties that favored them. That was a cliche and a battle cry clear through the 50s and the early stages of the Cold War. It was valid. I say we bring it back. How dare you, you can go ahead and trust if you want to, but how dare you ask me and David Schulte and Miro Todorovich to trust any Soviet agreement now that they have signed Helsinki and broken it so blatantly? I'm just too vexed for further comment. Can you imagine if the Soviet Union had a weapon that no other country could respond to?
Well, Barry, where would we have used it after the Second World War?
We could have cut off their Coca-Cola and strangled them into submission. We
cut off whose Coca-Cola?
Sir, I'm glad at this late stage of our deliberations you are becoming sensitive to silly remarks. You've made nothing but an unending torrent of them from the first minute you opened your mouth on these microphones. I am too well-bred and too polite to mention it, except in direct response to your insult. We have had the nuclear exclusive from 1945 to 1949, and we did not use it.
But we did. 2 nuclear bombs on Japan.
From 1945, after World War II, after that, we were engaged not in a war with the Japanese, but in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. We did not use, we did not brandish, we did not threaten the nuclear bomb in that confrontation. We did not use it, even though we were the only ones who had it, and nothing between the covers of your book or any other can take away that particular luster from America. As a drunken uncle who was real great when he was a heavyweight boxer, but is now belching and hiccuping and spilling beer all over the table and is a general nuisance in the area of defending freedom. I think that what Britain did in the Falkland Islands is making the world safer. I think that the Israeli actions, and I don't know, I tried to get into Lebanon, there wasn't enough time. I do not understand, particularly today's raid. I have announced my difficulty with what I consider the Israeli excesses, and the Israelis say, Barry, cut it out. Why should you be fooled for the first time in your life? You were never fooled by the Russians. You were never fooled. But they tell me that the casualties are in the tens and the dozens, and the media says they're in the thousands and so forth. But I think that apart from my confusion and heartbreak at what I consider to be Israeli excesses, I'm so basically in favor of what the Israelis are doing now. I'm in favor of what the Polish workers are doing now, and in no case, in none of those 3 pro-freedom and anti-Soviet acts, Argentina, or rather Britain versus Argentina, Israel versus the International Center of Terrorism. The world should send Israel a thank you note for striking at the heart of terrorism.
I agree, Barry. I think that democracy in any area of the
Sir, see,
is losing prestige in all parts of the world.
No.
Can I make one closing comment, Barry?
Certainly.
I just want to tell Peggy Fitzgerald that I'm doing everything in my power to help the carriage horses. Thank you for having me on, Barry.
Okay, let me just say something behind your back. I'm a little bit older than you are, you see, and I remember a day when we felt if we didn't do it, if we didn't stand up and do everything that had to be done to defend the free world, Britain would do nothing, France could do nothing. What do you expect from Norway, Greece, Turkey? Forget it.
And we are now seeing that these countries are looking at us and saying, well, all right, Uncle Sam must have had his day, but we're going to retake the Falklands anyhow. We're going to eliminate the PLO anyhow. And in Poland, we're going to do our best to get the Russians off our backs anyhow. I love to see resolve. I wish it were American resolve. I wish it were American-inspired resolve. I wish it were American-supported resolve, but at least there is resolve, and who knows, maybe we will catch back up with our past.
Barry, Pete McCloskey has a long history of supporting very left-wing causes. I have an ad here in my hand from October 3rd, 76, which Pete McCloskey signed. That included Dellums, Abzug, and McGovern. And that is an appeal for reconciliation with Vietnam, and that we want to have accept admission of Vietnam to the United Nations, to provide reconstruction aid to heal the wounds of war, to call upon our government to respond to the problems left by the tragic, unpopular, and unjust war in Southeast Asia. That's only part of it. And the monies, and also for reconstruction aid. And now, the monies are to go to the American Friends Service Committee, which has a long history of anti-Israel tirades. I've attended seminars on this. They've been at that since at least 1964, and they are viciously anti-Israel. They have said many times, they have, the American Friends Service Committee...
Ma'am, forgive me, I don't mean to insult you. It sounds like an insult, but I think I could let you go on for another 5 minutes, and you really wouldn't improve your point. I think you've made your point. I'm always glad to know who signed what when, but I mean, your tone of voice, like, oh, looky here, Congressman McCloskey, I've got you now. That's inappropriate. Sorry I have the last word by...
Morning television.
By the way, you don't have to go to Saturday morning television. The anti-war movement, having failed miserably to get the adults into the game this time around, and they have bombed all over the country with demonstrations that they were predicting thousands, ended up with dozens. When they predicted tens of thousands, they got a few hundred. And they are using kids from one end of the country to the other. In fact, one of my young gentlemen, Dave Bannis, did some research for me the other day on the children's crusades in the Middle Ages, because there has been nothing like this since the Children's Crusades, in which they are marching kids around and demonstrating. I think next that they'll probably try to get them all on ships someplace. The next thing you know, they'll be kidnapped and taken into slavery in North Africa someplace.
I think this is a hyperbole hour.
Does this kind of thing happen anymore? I hate to tell you how young...
You must be the satirist on this program.
They're using are you kidding? You don't know that they're using kids from one end of the country to the other?
You mean they've kidnapped these kids? They're kind of...
No,
their parents are the kids into the peace movement.
No, their parents are terrifying them. It's called the Children's Camp. One of the groups is the Children's Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. The nuclear threat, what kids can do, with pictures of little flowers, and then we have childish handwriting, which says, "Dear President Reagan, my name is David Hayes. I am 10 years old," and blah, blah, blah. And I've got clipping after clipping. I think this is one of the most revolting things I've ever seen. Children Walk for Life from June 7th every day to June 12th.
You mean there are no little right-wingers out there writing to President Reagan saying, let's arm more? And
no, I cannot imagine any of my friends getting their kids terrified of a nuclear war. And there are articles in here about how these kids are terrified of a nuclear war.
Well, that...
Get around to the Falklands. If you remember the war, then you will identify with what I'm talking about. There was an itch I could not scratch about the Falkland Islands for the first month of the whole crisis. And finally, when I identified it, I was so thrilled with having perceived all the way through. What is it about this crisis that drives me to the radio every hour? Or it did during the high point of it. That did not drive me to the radio during the Iran-Iraq war. I wonder how many other people independently came to this awareness. We ought to form a club. We ought to meet. Restaurants ought to give us a private room and a little bit of a discount. If you can prove that you are part of this awareness, then we are Siamese twins in all the important ways. When Britain started winning, it became the first time since 1945 that a dictatorship attacked a democracy and got its nose bloodied. Oh, I couldn't take it. I'm glad I'm young enough to absorb it. A couple more years and this thing would have been dangerous for my health. Not since the late Adolf Hitler did a dictatorship, in this case a junta. All right, so, I mean, a Nazi Germany, they ain't in Argentina, but a micro Mussolini, to be sure. I mean, they have a junta, not a parliament. They don't have elections. They have takeovers. Invading Austria-style, Czechoslovakia-style, Poland-style, Denmark-style, Norway-style, invading territory where they thought they would be safe and live happily and exuberantly and swaggeringly ever after. And here comes a democracy from half the world away. Can you imagine being half a world away and still in the Atlantic Ocean? Can you imagine being what they call half a world away and not even getting to the Pacific or the Indian, just the Atlantic, but way up top to way down bottom, boogada, 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 here they come. And they did their democratic thing. And I have such a nostalgia, such a lust about a democracy. There's so few. We're down to our last matches on a windy beach. There are only about 18 democracies left on the planet Earth. The UN has 154 dictatorship member states. For a democracy to come back against a dictatorship that thought it had it made. Who felt more secure than Argentina after the invasion of those little islands off their coast and so far from the fallen Britons, the fallen meaning no more an empire. Matter of fact, when they invaded the Falkland Islands, I heard Roosevelt in my mind's fantasy. I heard Roosevelt speaking the day Mussolini attacked France. You remember what he said, Charles?
Stab in the back?
Oh, no, that's what history will remember, but I remember what he said next. It does not take a very brave dog to bark at the bones of a lion. And I thought this was a dog. Come on! Don't tell me you don't remember that.
I remember the speech, the stab in the back speech, but I don't remember that line. I'm sorry I didn't.
No, it is at last. I had to live a lot of years before I achieved this luxury, but at last it's my turn to be the dogmatist. I have argued with people with fixed positions on birth control. I've argued with people with fixed positions on religious intermarriage. They are, alas, utterly incapable of change. I am utterly incapable of change when it comes to a democracy versus a dictatorship. Now, Charles Wiley is my mentor in the difference among dictatorships. We know there are authoritarian dictatorships and there are totalitarian dictatorships. But I say it's still spinach, and I say to hell with it.
Dictatorship.
Yeah, no. I say when you talk to me with your intellectual highfalutinism about the merits of the Argentine position and the British position, you may as well be talking to a Roman Catholic priest about the methods of abortion and trying to convince him that you've got a nice one. You may as well be talking to the rabbi about the ways and means of preparing pork. Don't bother me if you are not on the side of a democracy. If you are on the side of a dictatorship against a democracy, fine. I'm not going to hit you. I'm not going to throw an ashtray at you. But don't you bother me. I am not your customer, even potentially.
Well, I disagree in some parts with what you said before. Look, if it gets down to having to have a fight,
if you weren't here, I'd spend the whole time disagreeing with you. Make a reservation with me. Go ahead and preview your disagreement, and then I'll forgive you, and we'll get around to what Mr. Pike is doing.
Yeah, we want to get to his point.
Oh, really?
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. All right, and then we're going to argue about anti-war,
Charles,
though,
something told me you were going to disagree with this. Something told me you were going to take a pragmatic Western view that we need Latin America. Go ahead.
All right. First of all, the difference between what they did and what these other guys did, the Argentines came in and didn't hurt a soul. They came in and
How many people did Hitler hurt in Austria?
Oh, apparently, as soon as they got in, they started beating up people on all street corners.
The latest, a British report, and we have learned to trust the British since the days of World War II. The BBC could teach the Voice of America a lesson. The BBC built, maintained, and has forevermore maintained credibility. The Argentinian position toward the people in the Falkland Islands was wretched. In Darwin and in Goose Green, they herded the people. They lived for a month in a public hall. They ransacked their homes. I mean, come on, this was a lot less benevolent than the Nazi occupation of Danzig.
No. Wow. I would not say that. I mean, the Nazis... I think, first, that it is different.
Store.
It is different than what the Nazis did. Secondly, I think that they do have somewhat of a case for the islands. I agree with you that you don't go in and invade somebody's territory, and if you had to have a fight, I would support the Brits. However, I feel awful that there was a fight at all. There had to be a way out of this, and I think the United States, and I don't like to be critical of the Reagan administration, but I think the United States should have found a way to get Mrs. Thatcher and the head guy down in the Argentine together and get some kind of a face-saving device where both sides could get out of there without absolutely being destroyed in the process. I mean, $1.5 billion of British ships in the South Atlantic, not to mention, or to mention even more so, a lot of dead British and Argentine kids. That's awful.
Would you have felt that way had we sent a task force to the Persian Gulf at the time of the hostage crisis in Iran? An awful lot of people for an awful little bit of insignificant whoop-de-doo.
That's not well.
The British saw it the same way, and I am on their side. Now, speaking of who has a case, who could have a better case than the Nazi Germans seeing Volksdeutschers, their own flesh and blood, under foreign flags like Austria, and worse, Czechoslovakia. And here was a part of Germany, Prussia, separated by what? Poland? Poland, my soul. I mean, if my part of North Carolina were separated from a different part of North Carolina by a hunk of Brazil, I mean, I'd have picked up a sickle and a hammer and a squirrel gun.
Not a hammer and sickle. Wait a minute.
A broken bourbon bottle and gone to the ramparts. I mean, don't come to me with emotional justification for aggression. Hitler had it, and Argentina had it, and I am overjoyed that a dictatorship that attacked a democracy got its nose bloodied. The world needs more of the aforegoing.
I don't totally disagree. I understand exactly where you're coming from.
All right. Jules fight. Headline, Biggie TV guide hauls off and slugs Biggie CBS News for a smear, quote unquote, pulled on Biggie General Westmoreland. This kind of thing doesn't go on very much in American journalism. It is my hope that it proliferates. Let me read one little burst of the TV Guide investigation. And Murray Barron, president of Accuracy in Media, is on one microphone. Don Kowet, co-author of this TV Guide special, Anatomy of a Smear, is here. Don's summary of what TV Guide's investigation found out is CBS began the project already convinced that a conspiracy had been perpetrated and turned a deaf ear toward evidence that suggested otherwise. CBS paid $25,000 to a consultant on the program without adequately investigating his 14-year quest to prove the program's conspiracy theory. CBS violated its own official guidelines by rehearsing its paid consultant before he was interviewed on camera. CBS screened for a sympathetic witness in order to persuade him to redo his on-camera interview, the statements of other witnesses already on film, but CBS never offered the targets of its conspiracy charge any opportunity before their interviews to hear their accusers or to have a second chance before the cameras. CBS asked sympathetic witnesses soft questions while grilling unfriendly witnesses with prosecutorial zeal, almost through with this multi-count indictment. CBS misrepresented the accounts of events provided by some witnesses while ignoring altogether other witnesses who might have been able to challenge CBS's assertions. CBS pulled quotes out of context, in one case to imply incorrectly that Westmoreland was familiar with a meeting where estimates of the enemy were arbitrarily slashed, a familiarity that was crucial to proving the conspiracy. And finally, CBS's own paid consultant now doubts the documentary's premise of a Westmoreland-led conspiracy. Co-authored Dr.
We went out and found Davidson, who, by the way, had appeared at that Westmoreland press conference and looked pretty healthy. Davidson told us that he had had cancer 8 years before. In the past 8 years, he'd been completely healthy. CBS had made, as far as he knew, no effort to contact him whatsoever. We then asked his permission to speak to his doctor to verify his statement that he'd been healthy and was not dying of cancer. and the doctor confirmed that for the past 8 years, he'd been completely healthy. We were unable to obtain a coherent explanation from the producer as to why Davidson, who was crucial, you see, if there were a conspiracy, Davidson would have had to have been at the top of it, because he was the guy who ran the intelligence operation. Well, that's correct. What I think it's fundamental to understand is that Sam Adams, the paid consultant, had spent 14 years compiling a set of chronologies, written on long legal pads and typed handwriting, of every event that he had witnessed or heard about, first or secondhand, regarding this debate over the size of the enemy, the order of battle, in 1967. What George Cryle, the producer of the documentary, did was he, in order to make his proposal, he went down and visited Adams at his farmhouse in Virginia and looked over the chronologies, and then on the basis of the material that Adams already had, he wrote a proposal for the documentary at CBS. Now, when we were doing our investigation, both Cryle and the executive producer, Howard Stringer, when asked when the notion of a conspiracy arose, told us, and I'm paraphrasing them, at the very end. When we were able to obtain the blue sheet, which is the proposal for the documentary, it was clear that the notion of a conspiracy was full-blown from the very beginning. Of 9 chapter headings in that blue sheet, 5 contained the word conspiracy. They could have written the documentary, the script, from that blue sheet and saved themselves a year of work, except for putting people on camera. Now, the crucial thing, the reason this is so important is because their argument is that they did not rely for their documentary on the work of Sam Adams, who had been basically conducting a 14-year crusade against the military in this issue. Their argument was that, well, Adams provided us with some research, and then we went out and did our own investigation, and the end result of that investigation was a conspiracy charge. In fact, the blue sheet proves otherwise.
Wasn't it a fact, Don, that Sam Adams, and the audience ought to know, he was a lower-level CIA analyst, not now with the CIA, had appeared before congressional committees pursuing the same allegation, and that the congressional committees, in effect, rejected his conclusion?
Well, I'd phrase it a little differently. He testified at the trial of Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo in 1973, where his testimony, he was cross-examined by a federal prosecutor. He appeared at the Pike Committee on Intelligence Hearings in the House of Representatives in 1975, in which his allegations were countered by people of the caliber of William Colby and others. There were answers offered. Our feeling is, we think the problem was that no one at CBS outside the producer who had read the Pike Committee hearings bothered to do more with Sam Adams and sit down and chat with him. In other words, this guy was brought in. He had this enormous amount of research which embodied a conspiracy charge against a living figure, a serious, serious charge. And no one went back and said, well, let's look at the Ellsberg trial and see what he said under cross-examination. No one said, let's look at the Pike hearings. They said, well, fine. I mean, they said, if you can, to the producer, if you can get these guys, the military analysts who claimed their reports had been suppressed and blocked, if you can get them to go on camera, then we have a documentary. Now, there was no one there to play devil's advocate. No one there to test Adams' story. No one, in fact, to even check facts once the documentary was done. It says in the documentary, Wallace says himself, that they went out to confirm Adams' research. and then do an investigation on their own on top of it. Well, we can't see evidence of their own investigation.
Make a judgmental comment. An analysis was done probably for the first time in modern content analysis and in modern investigations of what makes journalism tick, when two professors, Professors Rothman and Lichter, made a study by interviewing for over an hour each 250-odd different executive editors and journalists in the electronic and printed media. It was a widely celebrated and publicized study. And the analysis made after these interviews was that they overwhelmingly, first of all in their presidential preferences, they voted about 80 to 81% for George McGovern. And these are the gatekeepers who open or shut the gate regarding what we viewers and readers get to read and view. This powerful element is not a conspiracy. This is a cultural, political coincidence that in the 15 or 20 years, the media has attracted to it middle and upper middle class people coming from generally left liberal backgrounds and value judgments. And with respect to CBS, which in the opinion of Accuracy in Media is by far the worst offender in this respect, let me tell the audience what we at Accuracy in Media have alleged against, for instance, an almost unchallengeable embodiment of what is thought to be the austere, highly regarded and conceitedly highly regarded, when CBS itself acknowledges that Walter Cronkite may have been the most influential journalist in recent years.
Well, Murray and I are going to have a large divergence on this issue, because I think what he's implying is that the kind of thing we found in this documentary is endemic, at least to TV news. I want to go on record right here and now by saying that I think that the CBS Hard News Division is a darn good outfit. I think that they make mistakes. I think they're unbalanced sometimes, but when you've got 22 or 23 minutes to do the news, which is basically still a headline service, over a period of time, their pendulum tends to swing. I think that one thing that's not widely understood, I would characterize my political views as liberal. That shouldn't stop me as a good reporter from investigating a piece that comes out and defends a General Westmoreland.
Not if you would like to broaden this, and Don thinks it's just one documentary broad. At least that's my snap summary of your respective views.
There have been several published analyses of the various networks and certain of the leading national newspapers in their coverage of the Vietnam War, almost without exception, including a massive 7-year, 2-volume study by Peter Braestrup, who uniquely served in Vietnam for 3 major newspapers during that tragic conflict: the Herald Tribune before its demise, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He headed a team that made a massive study of the coverage of the Vietnam conflict. Edith Ephron and the News Twisters, Edith Ephron formerly on the staff of TV Guide, did the earliest work, and there were other studies made. And they conclusively, in my opinion, shatteringly, came to the same conclusion, and that is the consequences of the reporting, electronically and printed press-wise, was generally sympathetic to the Hanoi regime's purpose in that imperialist war, the imperialism being, in my opinion, that of the North Vietnamese, and hostile to Saigon and Washington's military and political policies. There is no question about it, because the practitioners of that bias, a number of them, have since 1975 gone public with confessionals, a kind of mea culpa journalism. So there's no question about that. Now let's look at Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite, February of 1982, according to Rita Irvine, the chairman of our board and our chief editor, in an address in Portland, Oregon, Ames report, June 1st issue, states the following, which was announced at the CBS shareholders meeting on April 21st. Says Rita Irvine, quotes, "Only last February, speaking in Portland, Oregon, Cronkite said that the United States should help countries such as El Salvador achieve their goals, even if it means interim steps of socialism and communism." Earlier, end of quote, earlier, Mr. Cronkite, in a visit to the Soviet Union, in an interview he gave to a Soviet journalist whose name was Vitaly Kobysh, Kobysh, the year being 1979. In that interview, Mr. Cronkite agreed with Kobysh, the Soviet, quotes, journalist, quotes, that it was a, quotes, a myth to talk of a Soviet threat. Mr. Cronkite told Kobysh that he had never agreed with the idea that the Soviet Union menaces someone and that the Soviet people were preparing for war. That interview was published in Moscow before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Cronkite told Kobysh that he wanted to tell his readers that I, quotes, consider myself a friend of your country, end quotes. When Mr. Cronkite was questioned about the interview, he asserted that he had been misquoted, but he could not locate the tapes that he made of the interview. And to the knowledge of Mr. Reed Irvine, has never demanded any corrections from the Soviet magazine that published the interview and the story. Even after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Cronkite apparently learned nothing about Soviet disinformation or the nature of their system. In the documentary run last summer called The Defense of the United States, which ran for 5 valuable, priceless evenings, 2 of the chief disinformation agents, disinformation being deliberately planted journalistic misleading articles designed to mislead the free public opinions of the free societies. The TV Guide only last week devoted another special story on the disinformation practices of international Soviet
using American television.
Using American television. On the program I just referred to, The Defense of the United States, 2 of the chief malpractitioners of disinformation, General Milstein and Alexander Bobin, were given, again, priceless time to pollute public opinion in the free societies with no reciprocity for Americans, equivalents of these 2 gentlemen, these 2 Soviet gentlemen, to reach the Soviet public. Now the question is there a political motivation? Yes, there is. In the opinion of accuracy in media, the political motivation arises not out of a conspiracy to subvert our country, but a value judgment of many at CBS that it is not at all unprofitable to advise the American people that the threat to world peace comes primarily not from Soviet aggression, but from the United States, the American overreaction to an exaggerated aggression and threat from the Soviet Union. Now, that's a broad charge, and let's see if we can document that.
Wait, Mark.
There obviously are tens of millions of people, citizens of the free societies, the democracies of this world. And what you have is a unilateral persuasiveness that's going on where the public opinions, the free public opinions, are subject to molding, to influence, because of the access, the very virtue of our free societies is a conduit or a vehicle through which a closed society where there is no effective public opinion, namely the Soviet Union and the communist satellites. And what you have is legitimately concerned and aroused and fear-stricken millions of men and women, and of course their families, fearful of a nuclear war. All of us are fearful of a nuclear war. The fact of the matter is that the phenomenon of demonstrations in Western Europe and in the United States, through the nuclear freeze movement, the ground zero movement, and comparable movements, fueled largely by this legitimate fear, applies generally to high income or higher income middle class elements in Europe and in the United States. Very little of the working class is involved, very little of the farming community, very little of the small business people. There are church leaders, not by any means unanimous on it, but large numbers of celebrated individuals. You have, in the last 2 months, a demonstration, Don, of the media, generically speaking, not reporting these movements so much as promoting them. Now, what do I mean by that? Ground Zero, back about a month ago, in terms of the turnout of demonstrators, was a fiasco, quantitatively speaking. Very little of the film or the tapes or the reportage on the Ground Zero movement emphasized the fact that there was virtually a minuscule response. But in viewing the television screens, we at AIM noticed that not only was the commentary accompanying the pictures failing to tell the viewers that the turnout was minimal, but the camera work was angled so that at no point could the viewer look above and beyond the handful showing up in these demonstrations throughout the country to see the vast open spaces. But it was really ground zero. The cameras were from ground up, whereas demonstrations to right to life, anti-abortion, or anti-freeze, if you will, if no pun is intended. The fact of the matter is there were larger turnouts in opposition, though both turnouts were very minimal. But the camera, when 3,000 showed up at the White House opposing the Ground Zero movement, the camera was elevated so that beyond the 3,000 you could see vast open spaces of unattended acreage, whereas the camera with respect to the lower turnout for Ground Zero was from the ground up. Now, is there a conspiracy? Let me repeat for the third time tonight, of course not. What you have, in terms of the profitability of this, is a vast consuming public that on environmental issues, on nuclear power, peaceful use of nuclear power, and the threat of nuclear war, there are millions of people ready to demonstrate. You can get 95% of 5% of a population out, and you can get 5% of the balance of the population out, because the great mass of people are sincerely concerned about the threat of nuclear war, but the great mass of people in Western Europe, and especially in Germany, where close to 80% of the Germans in polls after polls after polls have affirmed that their primary friend in the world is the United States of America. That's a buried story in the network news.
I'm sorry, I've just got to interrupt what's going on. You've got to lead in. This is such an incredible little comma.
I don't know that it's particularly relevant. Yes, it is in a way, because Louis Fisher, whom I knew, it's a name that many people of the younger generation don't even remember, was a combination of an early apologist for Soviet Union and Soviet terror, if you will, who then broke. And broke during the Spanish Civil War, but before he broke, it's interesting to know that Herbert Matthews, a name that some of you may not remember, who was an editor of the New York Times and who helped to promote the acceptability of Fidel Castro in masterful pieces of journalism in 1957 and 58. Herbert Matthews had come from glorious and glorifying journalism hailing the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia. I don't know, Don, whether you know that. And Herbert Matthews is that rarity, joining with H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw, who were admirers of Mussolini and Stalin, both. During the Spanish Civil War, my late brother was a socialist correspondent for American socialist publications who went over the Spanish Civil War and sent back dispatches, generally pro-loyalist, in fact, without exception pro-loyalist, until being just about the earliest and outraging the liberal journalists of that period, began to reveal that behind the loyalist lines, the Stalinists in the Spanish Civil War were slaughtering anti-Stalinist, anti-communist loyalists. Now, that tragedy, of course, was finally dignified and verified by the historic book by George Orwell called Homage to Catalonia. And then others began to validate what is now known as a matter of historical fact, that the Stalinists were fighting two wars, one against their anti-Stalinist allies within the loyalist ranks, and the other on occasion against Franco-fascists. So that Sam Barron came back to the United States, and to the chagrin, with my approval, to the chagrin of Norman Thomas, then head of the Socialist Party, appeared before the Dies Committee, D-I-E-S, Congressman Dies of Texas.
Martin Dies, yeah.
Martin Dies, who was then, he was an earlier so-called Joe McCarthy, who was exposing real and occasionally alleged communist depredations. And my brother broke the story of these horrors. And he was denounced by many socialists throughout the world, but not by all, as having, in a sense, betrayed the loyalist cause, when all he was testifying to was the betrayal of the loyalist cause to the extent of the killing and slaughter of thousands upon thousands of anarchists, Trotskyists, and social democrats.
And your brother was physically attacked by Jimmy Hoffa?
My brother, before we get to Jimmy Hoffa, my brother then was captured by the Stalinists when he made a second trip, although he's warned not to make that trip, and slated for execution. But the guard of his cell proved to be a secret socialist, Spanish socialist, and he freed him one night. My brother walked many, many miles to get out of Spain, and then broke the story through the New York Times. Now, the New York Times at that period, Don, you may not remember this, did a remarkable thing in terms of journalistic ethics and practice. The New York Times had two correspondents in the Spanish Civil War. One was Herbert Matthews, giving the bias of the loyalist side, and the other was William Carney, a Catholic, American Catholic, who was sympathetic to the Franco-loyalists. And so the New York Times, in its ingenious effort to retain circulation...
The Franco-fascists.
Yeah, Carney was writing sympathetically to the Franco-fascists. And the New York Times was able to keep two reading subscriberships. One was the loyalist Americans and those pro-Franco Americans. Now, my brother, in later years, was a very high official of the Teamsters International, and in 1962, because he was opposed to the underworld elements in the Teamsters, and for other reasons, was set upon physically and beaten physically by Jimmy Hoffa in my brother's own office, which was a few feet from that of Jimmy Hoffa. And the media at that time, of course, in Congress, exploded. The Kennedys in that period supported my brother. Now, with the CBS documentary called Anatomy of a Smear by TV Guide, fortunately, comes at a time when millions upon millions of Southeast Asian victims of our defeat in Southeast Asia have lost their lives in the second major Holocaust of our generation. And precisely in 1982, upon whom does CBS direct its powerful lenses? On an alleged, a fictitious conspiracy by the general of our armed forces.
I think your point is well taken. It's at the root of the problem. It's that these things, especially the documentary, but television in general, is enormously powerful. And it has the power to convince. You don't have to have a predisposition to believe in order to be convinced by a documentary like this. It's a powerful, slick piece of work. And unless you get in and see what goes behind it, you have no reason to refute or doubt it.
Do you remember the point you were about to get
in? Yes, I do.
Go ahead.
Okay. I was trying to illustrate the kind of thing that we don't find in hard news, television hard news, that we did find in this documentary. I was saying that hard news tends to balance out, I think. This is my feeling. And that you can disagree with the content, but generally the procedures fall within accepted practices of journalism. I was illustrating the point of what we found in this documentary with the way the interview with General Joseph McChristian, who was the chief of intelligence, who immediately preceding the period on which this documentary focused, was used on air. Since McChristian would not comment on the events that were really discussed in the documentary, since he was not there, his interview with CBS opened with a series of hypothetical questions of the nature of what would you do if such and such occurred during your command. And this went on for a couple of pages of transcript, maybe 3-4. Westmoreland's name was never mentioned. Then there were some intermediate dialogue, some questions, some answers. And then the subject of what McChristian's relationship with Westmoreland was entered into. Now, what they did was they took these hypothetical questions and slotted them in to the substance of the documentary so that they appeared to be comments on Westmoreland's behavior. Now, according to the transcript, they were not. They were simply of the nature of what would you have done if such and such, no names, had occurred during your reign. One other quick example. The Westmoreland's co-conspirator was Danny Graham. One of the central charges against him was that he had asked a couple of junior officers to change the database of the computer. This is where all the stuff about how many enemy you had was kept. And what they simply said was that Graham asked these guys to change the database arbitrarily. And they had somebody on screen, James Meacham, Commander James Meacham, who's now the military correspondent of The Economist in England. Meacham was allowed to say that, something to the effect of, I'm paraphrasing, he wanted us to do it, in the end we did it. Now what they left out was that when Graham made this request, there was a meeting convened by the guy who was in charge of all of them, General Philip Davidson, who they never interviewed. Davidson heard both sides, and he said, let Danny do it. So they had eliminated everyone between Graham and Westmoreland in order to make it seem as if there was conspiracy. This kind of thing we don't find in when we look at hard news, antagonistic toward the Soviet Union. In other words, there's been all this propagandizing on the part of the media for all of these years. Why isn't it reflected in the common folks' attitudes toward the Soviet Union? It doesn't seem to have been very effective.
Now, decisive is the word, not effective. It's effective, but it's not decisive. After all, Reagan was elected. And 85% of the newsmen are anti-Reagan. McGovern had the support. If you remember, the Newspaper Guild committed a faux pas when its executive board in 1972 voted to endorse McGovern. And even McGovern supporters were astounded. Do you remember the incident? Where for the first time, an ostensibly neutral profession, the Reporters of America, overtly announced support for a presidential candidate. And they quickly withdrew. Now, with respect to the manipulation of TV, please recall, listeners, that in the program in 1971 called The Selling of the Pentagon, another scandal took place when CBS confirmed that they had spliced an interview with the press secretary of the Defense Department in which, I forget his name, was it Henkin? I forget the name of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Relations, or whatever, information. He was interviewed so that the answers that the viewer got off the screen seemed to be answers to the questions immediately preceding it. And it was found that the editors had spliced his remarks in other connections and selected out appropriately questions and fitting answers. Now, don't tell me that that isn't ideologically motivated.
All right. When I remember, just let me tell you the experience I had, because you didn't have one like this. I lucked out. I was in another communist country, Yugoslavia, downtown Zagreb, and I, too, was in the company of two members of the Young Communist Whoop-de-Doo. And we were walking down a beautiful street, and one of them said to me, in people's Yugoslavia, we have eliminated illiteracy, have eliminated prostitution, and at that moment, like a stage cue, Woody Allen would never do a movie this tacky. It's much too Hollywood. On cue, the minute he got to the sound in prostitution, out of the night came the most beautiful young woman, and she paid no attention to them whatsoever, because she could tell by their clothing that they were locals. She could tell by my clothing I was from out of town. And she just came up to me like some burly, wiggling her hips, and she was sweet as a squashed-out honeydew melon, I don't mind telling you. Good-looking young woman. And she said, my place, not far. And I didn't, I wasn't so inclined. I didn't come here to brag morally, but I wasn't interested in that. But I wanted to embarrass those communist youth members, don't you see? So I said in my few little words of Serbo-Croatian, koliko, koliko, that means how much? And she said, hiljada dinara, 1,000 dinars. That wasn't so frightening in those days. And I started feeling my pockets, and I said, yeah, imam samo pet store dinara. I only have 500, and then she said, no, 1,000. I said, well, in my hotel I got more. She said, okay, let's go. And I just wanted to, you could see like an animated cartoon, those two communists getting smaller and smaller and smaller. If there had been 10 seconds between him saying we eliminated prostitution, you understand? Wonderful. It would not have been so embarrassing, but there wasn't 1/10 of a second before his claim, his boast that they had eliminated prostitution, before the most beautiful prostitute in the Balkans came looming out of the night. But I only scored half a humiliation because she was literate.
I'd like to give a little something for conservatives who have been kind of down on President Reagan's foreign policy, saying, it's the same as Jimmy Carter, things really haven't changed that much. I'd just like to read a very short thing on the National Review that will kind of, give us hope in Ronald Reagan again. Just very quickly, it says, Pravda and TASS are in a tizzy. Ultra-reactionary, says one. Spreader of filthy lies and slander, says the other. The incantation goes on. Enemy of détente and of liberation movements. Attacker of the freedom of people and of democracy. Cold warrior. Enemy of the poor, and on and on. The occasion is the announcement that State Department counsel James L. Buckley has been named president of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. It says Buckley's appointment has been acclaimed in emigre circles where he is considered to be a friend of the captive peoples. And it says Buckley's appointment to RFE Liberty coming on the heels of naming of Reader's Digest senior editor Kenneth Tomlinson as Voice of America director indicates a new seriousness in Washington about using a weapon readily at hand in the battle for men's minds that we are now waging with the Soviet Union.
But I would say to the Soviets, international radio and one day international television will be a major political weapon, nonviolent, no fallout, doesn't ruin crops or anything. And if they don't quit lying about us, we will start telling the truth about them.
Okay.
We don't tell the truth about them. We are pussyfooting and namby-pamby. I think we must define the role of the USIA, the Voice of America. It is an American propaganda arm. It should clench its fist and strike like one. Look at our product, democracy. Thank you, Susan. You put me in an awfully difficult position, because let's just speculate this. I am trying to get Americans more conspiratorial-minded. If somebody waving a Greek flag were to be stomping an 80-year-old woman on the pavement in Times Square, waving a Greek flag and yelling, "Long live Greece," then an American looking will say, gee whiz, these Greeks are misbehaving. Every European will know instinctively that that's not a Greek. It's a Turkish provocateur designed to give Greece a bad name. Now, here we have what we call open phones. We have an election coming up. We have intelligent-sounding people like you. Now, don't be angry. I'm going to question you. I'm going to question your credentials. We have very intelligent-sounding people. Do you know how many minutes? I don't have enough money to buy the political time you've already given to Reagan's opponents in this upcoming election. Now, here you are saying something, so effective, Barry. This drop in the rate of inflation is a sham. It's a consumer fraud. Rents are skyrocketing. Supermarket costs are skyrocketing. Ma'am, how do I know? How do I know you're real? You are certainly very effective if you are real or unreal. But since I know that if you are real, you know you're real, and my question is infuriating. But how can I? You are stating your convictions. I am holding you up as an example of how to listen to politics on the radio and how to watch it on television. A report of a politician going into a supermarket, a typical day in the life of a campaigning candidate, and the reporter is, two children turned their head away. One of them said he preferred bubble gum. The other one said, who is he? And you read all these little down digs, and then at the end you see an indignant woman with a shopping cart saying, why doesn't he take his sales pitch elsewhere? I don't care about him. I want to get on with my shopping. And you say to yourself, if you like that candidate, too bad that these people happen to say those things while that reporter happened to be there. Meanwhile, most people don't see through it. They say, too bad, my candidate had a bad day yesterday. The other guy, wow, he really lucked out.
Mr. Farber.
It is very easy to find a lady with a shopping cart, quote, saying, unquote, things like that. Sir, if you were my economics teacher and you talk like one, I would not be your friend during the coffee break after the class. I'd say it's all a little too neat to me. He's got his, forgive me for, I did not mean to cut you off. I merely wanted to point out that you've got your chalk stripes on your playing field a little bit too neatly for my taste. Grant just walked in. He inspires me. You know what I admire about Bob Grant? Bob Grant does not say to his emotions when they come charging in, hey, get out of here. You can't get on this stage. You're nothing but emotions. Only intellect is allowed to play on this stage. Bob lets a few of his emotional spear carriers come out there into the final scenes of an opera now and then. And I just must say, sir, you just sound to me. Nobody knows who you are. This can't embarrass you in your daily life. I'm the world's foremost authority of what you sound like to me. You sound to me like a soldier of the old left, marshaling the same tired old mathematical formulations, hoping that starry-eyed young people will sit silently at your feet and take notes and go forth and break up dinner parties of their own with your condemnation of what's going on right now. Election, as you know, is Tuesday after next. May I repeat, you are not necessarily urged to vote. Not by me. Not by me. If you don't think enough of going out and voting by yourself, I don't want your vote to be as powerful as mine. My vote is a guided missile aimed at better government. If your vote is going to be a herd of raccoons or sheep or somebody who do, a flock of pigeons, somebody waved a broomstick and there you go chirping and flapping your wings toward the polls, I don't want your vote to count as much as mine does. I'm sorry. Stay the hell away if you don't, A, know that there's an election, and B, care enough to make a considered judgment. The beginning of the Ronald Reagan administration. I want to put this as clearly on the line as I can so you'll know what to try me for as a war criminal if that's the way history unfolds. When I voted for him, I saw that as the beginning of getting an obese, alcoholic, dyspeptic, disoriented America into United States Marines boot camp at Paris Island. They schlepped us off the train. They took us on the khaki bus. We're now in boot camp. We're in the barracks. They're not giving us everything we want to eat. They're making us do exercises we don't want. We feel tortured in our bodies and our minds and our souls. We lie in bed and moan and complain all night. Things do not feel that they are getting better. But our lives have been saved. We're going to come out brand new people by having abandoned the disastrous procedures and policies that got us here and will emerge anew. I must cut you off symbolically. Not only have we gone a little bit too long, but my answer to your question is we wait a little more than half of a presidential term.